Hello, my name is Roy Moisey, and today I'll be positing a counter theory to the Big Bang. But first, we want to cover a few very simple primary forces of the universe, being time, energy, and space. Now, the Big Bang theory posits that time does not exist before the Big Bang, namely when matter emerges. Time is not dependent upon particles. Quantum time progresses whenever energy value changes at any quantum relative zero point in space, and we'll get into that later. Particle time, or general relativity time, progresses whenever a particle changes its position, orientation, or state in space. And the state is just to cover all the bases. Energy, now in general relativity, there is only kinetic and potential energy. The same is true for quantum mechanics or quantum physics. Space. The Big Bang theory states that before the Big Bang, space existed as a one-dimensional zero point in space, or point of space. The mutability of space is limited to the energy being exerted upon it. The linear distance values of space are immutable. If the linear distance values of space were mutable, then theoretically, as black holes increased in mass index and their gravitational increase or influence increased, if they were actually compressing space itself, then theoretically the event horizon would either stay at the same position or shrink, but that is not what would happen. As the mass index increases, the gravitational influence reaches further and further out, and the event horizon would expand. Now here you see a list of what I call cohesion principle hierarchy. And at the top is angular momentum, pure kinetic energy, which is just a two-dimensional line of force. When it achieves angular momentum, it achieves the most resilient form that it can. And it becomes very, very long living. Congruent, incongruent, and opposing energy all fall into a hierarchy of influence, and with ratio inversions there would be a paradigm shift in the influences. And at the bottom we have latent cohesion, which exists between separate states of kinetic energy, which is essentially the very base force for the emergence of gravity, which is actually a threshold margin influence of the lines of force that exist between every particle and every other particle. And it's proximity based. So we have the time-space relationship, which I hear about. The time-space continuum is responsible for the electromagnetic spectrum, and in my theory it involves sine wave compliance and lattice line theory, the latent cohesion and the cohesion to states. We'll get into that later. I need to cover the material emergence and some basics for the sine wave compliance, the lattice line theory, and the strand theory, because there's also the time-energy relationship and the space-energy relationship. And the time-space relationship consists of the sine wave compliance and the lattice line theory relationship. And time energy involvement has to do with the strong and weak nuclear forces, and it involves the sine wave compliance and the strand theory relationship. And the space energy relationship is actually the gravity problem that involves both lattice line theory and strand theory, which is the particle emergence from base scale stage particles, the premier emergent physical material state property particles, and then the atomic scale stage. But first, I want to get into the metaphysical state and the material property state. Now, I've got these in a nice circle because these always exert themselves. When energy exists, time exists. As already stated, only kinetic and potential energy exists, and we know that energy cannot be created or destroyed, ergo sum, time always exists. Energy needs something to exert itself upon or exist in, therefore space always exists. Now, there's something else. The other one is sine wave compliance. Now, lattice line theory is the latent cohesion that exists between all matter, particles of matter. And strand theory involves the progression of particles, the progressive scale stage emergence of particles before the atomic scale stage is achieved. Now what you're looking at here is a very crude two-dimensional depiction of the metaphysical state when it approaches sine wave compliance. The metaphysical state and the material property state essentially exist over equal spans of time. Think of the universe's energy, time, and space relationship as a metronome that vacillates between the two. So the metaphysical state, or rather the material property state, is the universe we know, and the metaphysical state is the state of pure energy dispersed and diffused throughout all of space over time. After the last time it was in a material state, it went through the metaphysical margin, it transited that state margin variance and lost all of its material properties, conventional material properties, while retaining its force, its linear force values. The disparate waves of energy that would course out in the early stages of the metaphysical state behave on a parallel with wave energy in a fluid state where it disperses and diffuses over time. And here you can see I've depicted 4 horizontal lines. Now, I make no assertion as to how much energy value is, and I should actually put a break margin here because it's probably way down. But essentially, these outer margins depict the overall range of energy values at any given quantum relative 0 point in space. And as the diffusing gets more and more uniform, those margins get closer and closer together, and over time the dispersed variances start to resemble a very uniform sine wave that, if you look at any quantum relative 0 point in space over time, you'll see the same apex to trough relationship in that space. But you may also observe that some of them will exist at the trough margin of the sine wave compliance state that's approaching, and other regions or other points in space will exhibit a trough to apex relationship that exists somewhere at the top of this sine wave compliance that is emerging. Now, if you look at linear distance values of space over time, just want to make sure I'm still recording. All right. So, if we look at linear distance values of space at one given point in time, we'll see that it shares a very similar pattern to the 0 points in space over time. When that state, that metastatic state that emerges, and I'm sure if one was to take an acrylic tank of water, cap it, and use laser interferometers and like high-grade cameras and smack the side of the tank with a rubber mallet and record the dispersal of energy waves through that tank of water, over time, eventually you'd end up with a metastatic pattern emerging, and you'd probably have to look really close to the molecular level to see it, and it would take a long time. But essentially what happens at that point is that all of the values of energy variances between the region of space that exhibits a lion's share of quantum relative 0 points in space that have trough to energy reciprocation down in the bottom end here, versus vastly removed regions of space that have a greater proportion that exist at the top. The values above the mean margin start to migrate towards this apex region, and all of the values below the mean start to migrate towards this trough region. And all that means is that all of the higher energy values are going this way, because all the lower energy values are going that way. And what happens is sine wave inversion. The S-shaped sine wave turns into a J or Y. I'm not entirely sure how they term that. But it allows it to transect the zero energy margin value, the zero energy value margin, where a 0 point in space exists without kinetic energy existing within it. When that happens, this incline already existing, a mega massive void of space emerges, and not just one, because it doesn't happen in just one place. It happens throughout the entire metaphysical state on a large scale. And you can see here I've got an apex position depicted in 3 places here, and these are absolute vacuums that produce a compression margin in that metaphysical state that starts to have very defined parameters, and in that compression those nice remaining S waves compress and the apex values skyrocket and the trough values plummet until they again are very close to the zero energy value margin, and that's when the second margin of separation is achieved. But at the same time, I suspect, because between the 2 absolute vacuums there's a mid-range where the compression isn't quite as strong, but the energy value disparity produces a margin of separation here as well, causing this to contract in the opposite direction to resemble this. Now, this is very simple and two-dimensional. Each of these diminishing amplitudes and increasing doppletudes could be represented billions of times before each progression would be observed, as I'm asserting that this distance here is at least 40 billion light years, or well, 30 billion light years. Just want to make sure I'm still recording, and I've got 5 minutes left. 5 minutes. All right. So as that second margin of separation is achieved, at the leading edge of that vacuum, as the second margin emerges, give me one moment here, just got to get this looks a little busy, and it is, again, just a two-dimensional, very simple representation. Now you can see here the absolute vacuum margin, and these nubs are just the forms as the second margin of separation starts to emerge. These nubs form, and they essentially represent the equal value to this, so that all of this is the same energy value as this. Now the margin of separation, what I call the extrapolation event. Now this is my interpretation of it, and it's basically just a margin of separation that parcels all of the remaining diffused kinetic energy, and as I've drawn here very crudely in my first dry run, the separation progression diverges this way, and this parceling starts to compact and collapse, and as the parceling is completed, the vector shift in collapse is very slight, but the overall energy value achieved in this incline, by the time the parceling is complete, the collapse apex shifts from light years in advance to somewhere here, where the entire parceled kinetic energy enters this collapse matrix through a 0 point in space and emerges as a toroidal field. Now here's just a very simple diagram of a toroidal field, and you can see the directional lines of the kinetic energy, and essentially that toroidal field allows the angular momentum to establish itself, and that was a very crude drawing showing hardline margins, which there wouldn't be. It's more on a parallel with a magnetic field where there's a very faint outer extremity, and there'd be an apex range of energy value. And essentially that's it for the particle emergence part, other than this here is essentially a representation of a cube grid of space. If you were to look at it as being stretched at the diametric corners, you'd end up with a diamond pattern like this, sort of, a little more complex. Let's see, there was something else. Let me just pause for a moment and collect my thoughts. So essentially, the cap off, that is how the universe so uniformly and ubiquitously subdivides all of its kinetic energy to produce particles to exist in the astronomical range of particles. Now, there was one more thing. I will have, right, when they emerge all together in a slight kinetic incline already existing, and essentially when all of the kinetic energy of the universe has been turned into matter, only potential energy remains to be converted into particle velocities. Now, stay tuned for my Culminex A video on how these base scale stage particles, these quantums, achieve the atomic scale stage through strand theory. And look for it very shortly under Culminex, Culminex. Thank you. Have a good day.